Welcome into Off the Air, the legacy of WFUV Sports. I'm Andrew Gullotta alongside Alex Wolz, and this week we have a very special guest, WFUV alum and the radio voice of the Washington Nationals, Charlie Slows. Thanks for joining us, Charlie.
You're welcome, guys. Good to talk to you.
And I first wanted to ask you, before we get to your time at Fordham and look back at some memories about baseball, and obviously baseball's back after the lockout. I know you're probably very excited about that, but I'm not sure if this is for the Washington media, so I'd love to hear your kind of take on this. But we heard that Howie Rose and Michael Kay, they'll be traveling to road games for the first time in a few years. Is that the same for the Nationals? And how are you excited to, finally travel and all that stuff here?
Oh, wow. Are we excited when we were told that normalcy will return and that we are going to travel? Because while it might have sounded mostly normal to people, especially last year, listening to broadcasts, it was definitely not normal for us trying to do games off a series of TV monitors and piece together what we could see versus what we couldn't. And, sometimes being a little hesitant and late. And basically I almost felt like we were merely acting at times, that we were trying to make it sound as if we were there, but there were times that you just couldn't cover it up. There were things that you couldn't see. That things that were not shown to you, and we were just at the mercy of the pictures.
And I think part of the reason, Charlie, why people do care so much about, what broadcasters are doing and care so much about baseball is because they love the sport. And something I kind of wanted to start with you was your love for baseball, and kind of when you were a kid, in New York and before you went to Fordham, what kind of, made you fall in love with baseball in the first place, in the sport that you thought you might want to spend a career in?
If I write a book someday, that's probably the question you've got to answer for people almost right away. It was the sense of the first time you walk into a ballpark and you see the green grass and just the enormity of it and how a crowd reacts, not only in baseball, but any spectator sport. When a goal is scored in hockey, when a ball's put in play in baseball, a big shot in the NBA, the roar of the crowd. And, I always, just early on, when I started following sports with, not as many things were on TV as they are now. So you found yourself listening to the radio broadcast. And as much as I followed the game, I followed the broadcasters that would look to see where they were positioned. And, I think early on, I felt like, well, if I couldn't do what they're doing on the field or on the ice or on the court, I want to do that because that's pretty cool. They pay you to do that for a living, and that's what you do, and then you go home at night. That sounds like a pretty good life to me, and I've been fortunate to say that that's how it's gone for me.
And it seems like you fell in love with broadcasting at a young age. Was that the reason that you wanted to attend Fordham and join WFUV?
Pretty much it took me that way. I grew up in Yonkers, not far from Fordham, just outside the city, and when the bug bit me and I was doing sportscasts at a closed circuit feed in my high school, and we ended up getting a Board of Education TV station, and we did the first local telecast of any kind of a high school football game that we recorded, and then we started doing other events, and I was still in high school, so I had to look for what was the next step, and I started listening to WFUV, and we had one-on-one on Sunday night, just Sunday nights then from 11 to 2, but it was still at that time the longest running sports talk show in New York, because there was no all sports radio. If anyone in your generation can imagine, there was no WFAN and there were no cell phones. Imagine that. So radio was big. Sports phone was the thing. If you weren't near radio, 976-1313, and a bunch of us all worked there too, is how you found out if someone won a game before it was on the 11 o'clock news. You wouldn't find out what happened in the game unless you knew somebody was at the game and called you. But people didn't call because they didn't run to payphones to make calls during games. They couldn't text you. It was a completely different world. But Fordham seemed like the place for me for a chance to do talk shows and play-by-play of every sport that Fordham played back then. We did basketball, football, hockey, soccer. We did it all. Ice hockey, ice level at the Riverdale ice skating rink, which I think was converted to a soda bottling plant over off the west side of the Major Deegan. I'm not sure what it is these days. You guys might know, but that's also where they used to make the Stella D'Oro bakery, and you would smell them baking when you drive by on the highway.
You mentioned a lot of things there, Charlie, that I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into. Sports Phone's definitely one of them. We've heard a lot of other alumni here, whether it's John Martin or Paul Dottino, talk about their experience at Sports Phone. And you also mentioned listening to a lot of New York broadcasters. Something I wanted to ask you was, I was coming across some articles and some interviews where you talked about some of the people that inspired you, Marv Albert or Marty Glickman, someone who obviously means a lot to WFUV. Could you just speak a little bit about some of the voices that you heard as a child that really resonated with you and what you try to take away from them as you got into broadcasting yourself?
Well, we had great announcers. The Mets, when I was very young, had Lindsey Nelson and Bob Murphy, two Hall of Fame broadcasters, and Ralph Kiner was with them the longest, was a very long time on radio and eventually just television. And the Yankees had their set of announcers then, Phil Rizzuto and Frank Messer, and Whitey Ford was doing games, and then Bill White in those years in the 70s and into the 80s. And then, of course, Marv was doing everything. When I started following sports, and he was doing just home games for the Knicks and Rangers on radio. They didn't have radio for every game. He would do, maybe both teams were on the road, and he would do one of them. And at the same time, he was doing Giants football when Marty Glickman moved to do the Jets on radio. And then the amazing thing to me was he'd be doing sports on Channel 4 during the 6 o'clock news at get done at 6:50, and then be at the Garden for the drop of the puck or tip off for a 7:30 game at the Garden. You could only do that in Manhattan. Get somebody to drive you a few blocks from NBC to the Garden, and then be back for the 11 o'clock news and do the sports on the 11 o'clock news. He was everywhere back then. And later on years, when I was in the NBA doing the Bullets, I reminded him of a time when he was doing the Giants on radio, and they had moved out of Yankee Stadium, waiting for Giants Stadium to be built. And before people remember, Giants and Jets actually both played at Shea Stadium for a brief time, but the Giants played at the Yale Bowl in Connecticut, and Marv flew by helicopter after a Sunday afternoon Giants game to do a Rangers Canucks game at 7:05. And I reminded him of that, and he said, "Well, Charlie, you have a memory for great moments in sports history." As everyone in New York growing up then had their version of Marv that they could do.
That's awesome for sure. I wanted to kind of continue on like that, the mentoring path and people you looked up to. Was there anyone specifically at, maybe your beginnings at WFUV early on that helped to mentor you? If it was, either professor, student, was there anyone that really, when you were just beginning at WFUV?
Well, it was interesting. I mean, as it would turn out, the time I was there, we had what now would be like a broadcast all-star team of people who were there at the same time. When I was a freshman, the seniors were Bart Bersterna and Dave D'Alessandro. Bart had a long career working in local sports radio in Connecticut. Dave went on to be a writer for in New Jersey and New York for a long time. And then, of course, the next few years was, Michael Kay, and I was in the same class with Mike Breen, and then the guys that were behind us, Bob Papa, John Giannone. I mean, so all of us have been fortunate to Paul Dottino, who you mentioned earlier, guys who came before and after us, who because of the experience we had at Fordham and the people we were able to meet and the reputation of coming from WFUV, that preceded us, some guy named Vin Scully way back. It didn't hurt. It helped. I mean, we always, I'm sure you always hear and it's ironic, my partner on the Nationals games, Dave Jagler, is a Syracuse guy. So it's kind of been like us against them, they probably put more over the years into the business, but we're not too shabby. And we have a great, I think, group of alumni who have been fortunate enough to have long careers.
Yeah, and definitely a friendly relationship too. We've had a few different Newhouse alums come back, talk to us, give us workshops. So definitely some overlap there. And something I wanted to ask you about too, kind of on that same note, is something I thought was very interesting. And I was reading some other articles and was wondering if you could comment on this, was the fact that you had some experience calling games before getting to Fordham and kind of showed off maybe some demo tapes as a way to kind of get on air a little bit earlier, which is something that we see a lot nowadays. A lot of kids in high school getting a lot of opportunities. So I was just curious on that note, your first days at FUV, when you first got to Fordham, what kind of work were you doing? Was it more calling games? Was it producing? Was it beat reporting? What was kind of your role at FUV very early on?
Well, the thing that was different is the station was completely student run then, except for general manager and a chief engineer. And so all the directors were students, your juniors and seniors for the most part. And so for sports, usually started out doing a 2 to 3 minute sports cast where they had 3 of them per day on weekdays, one in the morning, one in the noon news, and one in the 6 o'clock news. And that usually was what you started out with. Freshmen usually didn't end up doing play-by-play. Because I had experience and I submitted a demo tape, I was fortunate that usually you started out with women's basketball. That would have been the first place you started. There weren't many who could do hockey play-by-play. So we had a guy named Steve Shears, had a long career at CBS as a behind-the-scenes producer. And he was doing hockey at the time, and he heard my hockey tape and he goes, well, this is going to be you very soon. And really, for most of the time that I was there, I was the only one that did hockey play-by-play. We didn't do as many games. Basketball, being Division I sport, was really the predominant sport. And then you had women's basketball, Division III football at the time. You had soccer. Hockey was a club sport. But because of everybody's interest in hockey in New York, that was a great opportunity. And that's the thing, you had all the sports that we could do and the sports talk shows. You usually didn't start out doing one-on-one as a freshman. I think it took till second half of the year for me to get a chance to do one-on-one, and maybe freshmen might have done one show in that first year or even in their sophomore year. So we had a lot of people who got chances, but usually sportscasts were the things you had to learn how to do. And I grew up listening to people do sportscasts, so I had to in New York, you had Ed Ingles, who had a long career doing sports on WCBS. Dave Marish before him, who ended up going to TV News for a long career after that. So I was fortunate to learn by listening at all different times of the day, whether it was before school, listening to the morning sports, listening to games later, and then having the chance to go to WFUV and put my own spin on things and be able to put things together like that. It was just a great opportunity.
And as you said, so many games, whether it's hockey or football, basketball, whatever it may be. Was there any memories then you calling a game from Fordham that really sticks out to you, whether it was a learning experience or just like a really cool trip or something that just really sticks out to you?
Well, probably the most exciting game I got to call was in my senior year. It was the first year of the Metro Atlantic Conference, so they didn't have an automatic bid into the NCAA, and they made it to the championship game, and they won the championship game to win the conference tournament on a jump shot at the buzzer by Mark Murphy, who was a shooting guard. Now, unfortunately, it only got them to the NIT, and we did travel to Tampa. They played against South Florida. Charlie Bradley lit them up for a whole bunch of points. Probably the most famous basketball player to come out of USF. And they didn't win, but that was a whole lot of fun. Tom Penders was the coach then, and he was really fun, great to be around, great basketball mind, just a great personality too.
And you mentioned there Fordham basketball, and something I kind of wanted to talk about. You mentioned a little bit earlier your time, calling some basketball with the Bullets, and I was curious to talk a little bit about that and your time calling basketball. Obviously, you spent a lot of years at the national sense, but what were those 11 seasons calling basketball like? And was that something that you enjoyed doing, or how do you look back at that time as you were starting to get your footing as a broadcaster after Fordham?
Well, it was rather ironic. A year after graduation, I went to work at KMOX Radio in St. Louis, doing some behind the scenes work, and same way, started with sportscasts, eventually had a chance to do some sports talk shows. And then in a pinch, I got a chance at the end of the season because there was a conflict for actually it was Bill White, who was a Yankees broadcaster, was supposed to do the CBS radio game of the week with John Rooney, who's one of the voices of the Cardinals now and had worked at KMOX. And Lloyd Mosby dropped a fly ball in Toronto on a Friday night, and the Yankees won, and they were 2 games out with 2 games to go in the season. And so now suddenly Bill White's not coming. And I get a call. I was waiting for West Coast games to end to record a sportscast for Saturday morning. And it's John Rooney on the phone. He says, "What are you doing tomorrow?" And it was the Cardinals were about to clinch and win the NL East. I said, "Well, if they win, we'll be in the clubhouse, getting features and interviews through the champagne celebration for a special that we have to put together for Sunday night." And he says, "Well, how'd you like to skip all that and come to Kansas City and do the Royals A's game with me on CBS radio tomorrow night?" And it sounded like he was out somewhere with a lot of noise in the background. And I kind of asked him if he was, "Is this for real? Are you like inebriated at this moment?" Or and then he told me Lloyd Moseby dropped the fly ball in Toronto. He's not coming. Steinbrenner wants him to stay and do the 2 Yankees games. I said, "Really? And there's nobody else that CBS radio can find?" And he goes, "No, he goes, we've heard your demo tape. They liked it. You're 30 minutes away by plane, book a flight. You're coming and do the game." And that was a springboard for me to get a chance to do other things play-by-play wise. Somehow I'm tangenting off your question here, but this is how I got to the NBA, because a few months later, the guy I worked for at KMOX got a call from the Tidewater Tides asking about someone that they were considering to do their games. He said, "Yeah, that guy's okay, but the guy you want works for us. We'll loan him to you for the season." And that was me. And I ended up going to Norfolk, Virginia Beach for the summer to do AAA baseball. And I was supposed to go back to work at KMOX when the season was over. But about 6 weeks into that, I got a call from the guy I worked for in St. Louis asking me if how we found out about jobs then? If they were listed in Broadcasting Magazine in the classifieds in the back of the magazine. And the Washington Bullets and Washington Capitals were leaving WTOP radio and changing stations, both going to different stations. And the Bullets were advertising for a play-by-play guy. And so I sent a tape to them and a tape to the New Jersey Devils, who were looking for a new play-by-play guy at the same time. I have to tell you, the Devils have still not responded. They have not responded to my application. But I got a call shortly thereafter. I was in Columbus, Ohio. My girlfriend then, wife now of almost 35 years, was there visiting me. And she said, "Some guy from DC called. He wants you to call him after the game tonight," because there were no cell phones. He got the hotel number from the GM of the Tidewater Tides. "He wants you to call no matter what time you get done." And that was it. I was in the final 4 to be considered for the Bullets job. When could I come in for an interview? AAA baseball back then, we played 140 games in 144 days, 4 days off during the season. So I went in like the following Friday, interviewed for the job, and on Monday they offered me the job. So I went back to St. Louis after the season just to get my stuff and move to DC. And that started my 11 years of doing pro basketball with some baseball on the side for the Mets. I did games for them in 91. While I was also doing games for Tidewater again, I did fill-ins for the Orioles in 88 and 89. But, the NBA was a great experience. We talked about interviewing Marv Albert, who was the part of the era of transistor radio batteries burned out under my pillow when I was supposed to be going to sleep when I was 9 or 10 years old. And so, all of it has been a dream come true. Great experience. The time I went in the NBA, it was Julius Erving's last year, but we had Magic and Bird and Jordan coming and Isaiah Thomas and those Pistons teams, and then the Bulls teams. The only team that didn't really win in the time I was with the Bullets was the Bullets. In 11 years, we made the playoffs 3 times in a league where half the teams made the playoffs. My first 2 years, and then it took 9 more years. My last year with the Bullets, they made the playoffs when they had Chris Webber and Juwan Howard and that group that at that point in time coached. That was Bernie Bickerstaff replaced Jim Lynam in my last year with the Bullets.
And I kind of want to move over to baseball. And first, I know you were the play-by-play voice of the Rays, and obviously you ended up with the Nationals. When you joined, really both those jobs, both those franchises were extremely young. Is how different is it to work for a franchise that are just getting birthed out expansion type teams? Is it different than working for a franchise that's big, whether it be established?
Well, I'll let you know when I work for that real established franchise.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm working for them now that the Nationals have been around since 2005. I mean, the Bullets had a long history and they won an NBA championship, but that was really in a time when the NBA didn't fill arenas, even in the finals. It's hard to believe. You know, the NBA really didn't take off until the 80s, and David Stern really saved the league with what he did, really with the salary cap and the sponsorships that he was able to bring in, and making it so that the players were perceived as partners instead of employees. It really was great at what he did with the NBA. But it was different. I went to Tampa Bay. They had wanted baseball there for years. They built the stadium without a team in the late 80s, hoping to lure the White Sox. And then it looked like the San Francisco Giants were moving. They had everything printed up, Tampa Bay Giants. Vince Naimoli, who later would own the Rays, thought he was going to own the Giants, and looked like the deal was done. And Bill White, who I mentioned earlier as a Yankees broadcaster at that time, had become president of the National League. This was even going back when they had separate presidents, separate umpires for each league in Major League Baseball. But they did not want to lose the San Francisco market. And somehow they got Bruce McGowan, who was a minority owner of the Giants, to step up. And they arranged the financing and built their own stadium, and the Giants never moved. So, and then they thought they'd get the next group of expansion teams, but they went to the Miami with the Marlins, and then Colorado. And so they were the Cinderella without the glass slipper again, waiting for that expansion team. Finally happened, big build up in 1998, sellout crowd. I was there for the first pitch. And then when things changed and eventually got the job with the Nationals, it was, I think it was even more emotional opening day, first game back in DC, because they had baseball. They had two different genres of the Senators, the one that became the Minnesota Twins in 61, and then the expansion Senators that eventually moved to Texas in 72. But you had people coming into RFK Stadium, where the Nationals played their first 3 years. I remember the booths were off an overhang of the second level. So when you looked out of the booth, the stadium field was below street level. So when I looked out the back of our booth, I was seeing people come in when they opened the gates, and they arranged it so the Nationals would be taking batting practice second instead of first, so people would see them when they walked in. And I literally saw people, whether it was fathers with grandfather, with their father, grandfather. I saw men and women with tears streaming down their faces, because it appeared to them, RFK Stadium configured for baseball again, the way they remembered it when they had baseball as a child. And you're talking about a long time, from 71 to 2005, 34 years without baseball.
That's kind of something I wanted to follow up on. Is you've obviously had this long-standing relationship now with the Nationals since 2006, and I'm curious, what it's been like really building a relationship with a local team. We talk a lot in broadcasting about that allure of going national or doing things at a bigger scale, but there's something special, I think, about staying as a part of a community like you have in DC. What has that been like, building a relationship with Washington, with the Nationals, and how would you kind of describe that?
Well, people were so starved for it. I mean, we had an immediate built-in fan base. That first year, they averaged 34,000. They drew over 2.7 million fans the first year. There were a lot of skeptics that said that baseball would never work in Washington. And so that's certainly been proven wrong with a new stadium, and that you guys can see behind me, filled like that, and eventually getting an all-star game. And the area where the stadium built was basically a dilapidated, burned out part of the city. I mean, taxi cabs wouldn't take you there or come pick you up. And now it's one of the fastest growing areas in the United States, if not the world, as far as inner city areas to live in. And so it's been fantastic. Of course, culminates when you are able to, go all the way as they did in 2019 and win the World Series in somewhat, spectacular, miraculous fashion after a 19-31 start to the season. And then the way they won in the postseason was very dramatic, in winning the wild card game and beating the 106 win Dodgers in the division series in 5 games, with a lot of dramatic things happening in that series. Then they blew out the Cardinals in 4 games in the league championship series. And then everyone wrote them off after they lost all 3 home games in the World Series and had to go back to Houston for games 6 and 7, down 3-2, and more dramatics in the way they won that World Series. And so, we've certainly developed a relationship with fans. one of the things that, is still great for baseball radio broadcasters is you get to call the postseason, where the TV guys are done when the regular season ends. And so many people would turn down the network games and listen to us in the postseason. And so you have your ardent fans who've listened to you for years, but that developed a whole new following of people. And to be able to, that's the thing. So many people will make that jump to TV and may never get to call their team winning a championship. And that's something I'll cherish forever.
And you talk about that connection with Washington, and obviously when they won the championship, I think especially in baseball, you have that connection, especially with radio broadcasters, because it's really a sport that's geared towards the radio. And it's so, as a baseball fan, it's almost like you're watching it on TV almost, just it's really geared really well towards radio. Is that something, just that relationship with the listener, that you really love about baseball and doing it on the radio?
Absolutely. I think people hear more of what you have to say on radio. I mean, TV, I could watch a game with the sound down. Most people could, if you're a fan who follows it closely. But, for radio, you are the eyes and ears, and, you have the chance to incorporate stories. You're not at the direction of someone telling you what you have to talk about, because either they're showing a shot of it or there's pre-produced packages that were done before the game that they have to get in, game elements. I mean, we are the blank canvas when the game starts, and we can go in any direction that we choose to describe what's happening for the day. And that's what was frustrating the last 2 years of not being able to be with the team on the road. I'll give you a perfect example. When you weren't there, I mean, you couldn't watch batting practice. You weren't in the clubhouse. You weren't on the field. This morning at the first workout for Nelson Cruz, new DH for the Nationals, he's just tracking pitches the first time he's in the cage from Eric Fetty, who he's never seen before and doesn't even know, because this was his first day in camp. And when Fetty finished what was simulating an inning for him, walking off, Cruz walked right up to him and told him how he thought he was tipping pitches. And now you find out, well, why is Nelson Cruz so good at 41? Because maybe he knows what's coming. He can pick these things off very quickly, but to immediately do that with a player he's never been with. And then Nelson Cruz had a press conference after the workout today, because it was his first day with the club. And I specifically said, it looked like you were telling Eric Fetty about something he was doing when he was pitching to you. He said, well, he threw me the same pitch 5 times in a row, and after 3 pitches, I could tell that he was tipping it to me. So I immediately told him so he could fix it now. And so that's things like that are going to be invaluable to a young team when you bring in a guy like Cruz to the Nationals this year.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I wouldn't have known that if I wasn't here.
Yeah. And I know Andrew's called a couple of games off the monitor. Could probably tell you the same thing about how difficult that can be sometimes. And something I wanted to ask about too on that note, we're talking about getting into the broadcasting side a little bit more. You obviously have certain, unique things as terms of slogans or certain approaches to how you call games, whether it's a home run call or something that happens on the base paths. And I'm curious how you develop some of the unique things that you've learned as a broadcaster, and what you kind of think how your style is a bit unique for maybe other people that you listened to in the past, or how you try to be unique as a broadcaster in general.
Well, it's a good question, because one of my first demos was to Pete Silverman, who ran MSG Network when I was coming out of college. And one of the first things he said to me is, you can't sound like Marv Albert. You got, unless you're Kenny Albert, you can sound like Marv Albert. But the rest of us got to develop your own style. When you grow up listening to the same announcers all the time. So one of the things that helped me is when I went to KMOX, completely understated, different style listening to Jack Buck do a game. So these days with satellite radio, you have the chance to just listen to everybody. Back then, we had transistor radios trying to pull in a game from another city, good luck. In New York, we were lucky to have more than one team in each sport, so you can listen to more than one broadcaster and decide what things you like or what things you might incorporate, or what, trying not to sound like somebody else. But it's interesting. When I got hired to do the Bullets, the guy that hired me, his name was Goff LaBar. Goff LaBar, by the way, hired Howard Stern. the Greasemen, famous shock DJs, in his career. But Gofflabar's father went by the name of Bert Lee when he was on the air in the 1940s. He hired Marty Glickman to do the Knicks. And Marty Glickman basically invented basketball play-by-play on the radio. Well, Marty Glickman, who was the guy that he was the mentor for? He was the mentor for Marv Albert, who he hired to fill in for him while Marv was still in college at Syracuse. When Marty started to do other things and they needed, that's why Marv finished his degree at NYU, where Kenny went, because he needed to be in New York. Well, Marv grew up listening to Marty Glickman, and I grew up listening to Marv, and Gofflabar's dad hired Marty Glickman. So when he had his group of demo tapes for the Bullets job in 1986, he asked Marty Glickman to listen to his final group. And the guy that Gofflabar was going to pick is the same guy that Marty Glickman picked out of that group of tapes. That was me. And I had never met Marty Glickman at that point. I met him a short time thereafter. But he, the Marty Glickman, Marv Albert style of basketball on radio is a full descriptive staccato type play-by-play. You hear a lot of guys now don't give you a court description of where a guy is when he shoots the ball. They don't tell you the pass was a bounce pass or a lob. Listening to Marv, you got all that. A hook shot, a fadeaway. He told you if it hit the rim, the glass, the rim, and rolled around and went in. All of that. Not just it's good or no good, or here's the ball's to this guy, to this guy, to this guy, the shot's no good. And you hear a lot of that. And that's because a lot of guys grew up watching TV where you don't have to be as descriptive. But on radio, the more you give, the more people can see in their mind. And so if I have someone fill in with me on a baseball game, I found baseball to me is the hardest sport to step in and do on a fill-in basis, because it's kind of the rhythm of no rhythm with baseball, because of the pace can be fast when the ball is hit, and then there's no pace when nothing's happening. So whereas faster paced sports like basketball, you get a rhythm, you got your play-by-play. Usually when there's a timeout, you're going right to commercials. So there's not as much time to fill. So it's completely different. But, I'll sometimes have to remind someone to say, hey, it's popped up. You didn't say first baseman caught it. You didn't say whether he was in fair or, was it fair or foul? Because first baseman, third baseman are going to be near the line. So I always like to think, you got to tell people where they are on the field too, just like they are where they are on the court. And just I try and remember a lot. Hey, someone's tuning in for the first time. They may not know Juan Soto's a left-handed hitter. And it's very easy on radio to never say whether he's in the box from the right side or the left side, or remind people which way the pitcher throws, that he's right-handed, left-handed. These days, tell people that the pitcher's winding up, because so few pitchers are winding up anymore. They're all pitching out of the stretch, or some short, what I call no wind up, little league wind up.
For sure. All that stuff's it's definitely really interesting. And I kind of wanted to get into just about the industry in general. Obviously it's changed a lot since you've broke into it, and it's going to change probably in the next few years, or it has been changing really since COVID, especially in MLB. They just had the huge deal with Apple and NBC Peacock and all that stuff. So I was just kind of interested in what you think the broadcasting industry is really going into, and how would you recommend either, college kids, young professionals really tailor themselves towards those changes?
Well, it really depends what you want to do. If you want to do play-by-play, it's one thing to say, yeah, I'm going to do some practice games off TV. There's nothing like being in a game, even if you go to a high school game and there's 20 parents there, and you can find a spot to call the game, to get a rhythm of the game and see the entire field. I used to do that a lot. I used to go to major league games with a tape recorder and go to a spot where there was nobody, in the stands on a day when they're not, going to have a huge crowd, and do the game. I did it at hockey games. I did it at basketball games. If I got a credential when I was at FUV or Sports Phone, I'd find a spot and, at least do part of the game when I was there, whether it was whatever sport it was, just to keep doing it with a presence where it actually sounded like a real game. With it's so different if you're in an arena with an organ or whatever piped in music or a ballpark than it is. You to me, you just can't simulate the same sound and ambiance of a stadium or an arena by doing it off your television. And you can't, as you know, you can't see it all either. So it's you definitely don't have the feel for it that way. So that's my advice. Whatever it is, do as much of it as you can wherever you can do it.
Yeah, and I read a similar story about how you had called games, while playing, Little League baseball as a catcher. We heard similar things with Vin Scully doing the same thing when he was in the outfield calling games and things like that. And I know your broadcast partner with the Nationals had a similar story as that too. And kind of with all that put together, one of my last questions I wanted to ask is if you could just go back to talk to your former self when you came to FUV as a freshman, and you kind of mentioned it's all been a dream since, but what would be that advice that you would give to that younger self when they do start that career in broadcasting and how they can try and have success in it?
To me, it helps when you know exactly what you want to do. And a lot of young people, they'd come to FUV even back when I was there. Well, I like this, but I don't know if it's a career. The faster you can figure out what direction you want to go, the more of what you want to do is you can focus on. And, I even did, I DJ'd when I was there. I did newscasts to make sure I could write and read a newscast if I had to get that job. And that's the thing. I know people who want to do one particular thing, and I think you can pigeonhole yourself that way. You need to get a job in the business when you get out of school. Whatever way in that is in, rather than saying, well, I'll only do this sport, or I only want to be a sports talk show host. The more you can do, the more chance you have that you will get in the business. And I think that's the best advice I could give someone. Take advantage of everything there that they can offer you. Don't leave a stone unturned. Sleep is overrated.
For sure. And especially I think in today's day and age with technology and podcasts where you can just pick up a microphone and just start recording to your computer, it's definitely something that maybe it's a lot easier to do now compared to, when you were in Fordham.
Well, even a few years ago, if we wanted to do what we're doing now, I would have to be there.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, Zoom and this type of technology, of course, really blown up because of the pandemic, because people were at home. But this has opened, new avenues to way to do things. This is how most podcasts are done now. Nobody has to be in a studio anymore to do a show. If you have good enough equipment and, good enough ambient, make sure you have some carpet in the room so your sound isn't very hollow, then you pretty much could do anything from anywhere except the game. I still say you got to be at the game to do the game the right way. And so, at the top, you asked me, I mean, I'm ecstatic about being able to go back on the road and do the games the way they're supposed to be done. It's just, there's little things that happen on buses and planes or batting practice, to be able to incorporate stories in about a restaurant you went to, something happened in that city. I mean, we had nothing the last 2 years when the team was on the road and we weren't there. We're doing a East Coast game at 10 o'clock at night. You basically do all your prep at home and show up at the booth at, 20 minutes before you go on the air. It's just very detached from the reality of it.
I'll say this though, we definitely hope to see you in New York though when you come in. When the message down. I'm just going to say that.
It could have been opening day.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, it's going to be interesting to see how they work out this thing in New York with guys who can't play.
Yeah.
Because they're not vaccinated. I mean, for the NBA had 98% vaccinated. So you said Kyrie Irving doing this thing with the Nets where he didn't play, but got a ticket, showed up as a fan and sat in the first row. It was pretty funny. But then went in the locker room and got the team fined $50,000. Yep. It's a whole nother thing. If you have half a dozen or, several of your best baseball players on a team can't play at home, but they can play on the road, or the visiting team can play. It makes no sense.
We'll see.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll have to see.
But it's going to be a big topic, I think, in the next few weeks.
Yeah, but definitely when, like, as a Mets fan, definitely when they play the Nationals next time, I'll have to somehow get the Washington feed to give you guys a listen for sure. But the radio voice of the Washington Nationals and WFUV sports alum, Charlie Slows. Thanks for joining us, Charlie.
You're welcome, guys.